The bitter wind howled across the Colorado plains as Asher Young rode through the blinding snowstorm, his horse struggling against the mounting drifts that threatened to swallow them both. February 1876 had brought the harshest winter since George, Colorado, had seen in decades, and Asher cursed his luck for being caught in its merciless grip. His fingers had long since gone numb inside his leather gloves, and ice crystals formed on his beard with each labored breath that escaped into the frigid air. "Just a bit further, Maverick," he murmured to his chestnut stallion, leaning forward to pat the horse's frost-covered neck. "We'll find shelter soon." Asher had been riding for 2 days, making his way back to his small ranch outside of St. George after delivering a herd of cattle to the railroad station in Denver. The storm had struck without warning, transforming the familiar landscape into a treacherous white void that threatened to claim him with each passing minute. As Maverick trudged forward, Asher squinted through the swirling snow, searching for anything that might offer refuge. It was then that he spotted something unusual, a dark shape against the endless white. At first he thought it might be a fallen tree or perhaps a boulder, but as he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest. It was a person, half buried in the snow. "Whoa, Maverick," Asher called, pulling the reins and dismounting with a speed that belied his exhaustion. He stumbled through the knee-deep snow, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to hold him back. When he reached the figure, he brushed away the snow to reveal a young woman. Her face was deathly pale, lips tinged with blue, and her dark eyelashes rested against her cheeks like crescents of night against a field of snow. She wore a traveling dress that offered little protection against the elements, and a small carpetbag lay several feet away, nearly buried in the mounting drifts. Miss, can you hear me?" Asher called, removing his glove to touch her cheek. Her skin was like ice, and he couldn't feel a pulse in her wrist. Panic surged through him as he quickly unbuttoned his heavy coat and wrapped it around her still form. "Don't you die on me," he muttered, scooping her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he cradled her against his chest as he carried her back to Maverick. With difficulty, he managed to mount while holding her, arranging her across his lap so he could keep one arm securely around her. "Hang on, miss," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. "I've got a cabin not far from here." The journey seemed to take an eternity, with the snow growing deeper and the wind more vicious with each passing minute. Asher kept his head bent low, shielding the woman's face from the worst of the storm with his broad shoulders. He could feel the cold seeping into his own bones now that he'd given up his coat, but he ignored it, focusing only on the faint path ahead and the precious burden in his arms. When at last he spotted the outline of his modest cabin through the curtain of white, he nearly wept with relief. Maverick, sensing home, picked up his pace, and soon they were at the door. Asher dismounted awkwardly, careful not to drop the unconscious woman, and kicked at the door until the latch gave way. Inside, the cabin was cold, but at least they were out of the wind. Asher gently laid the woman on his bed, then hurried to start a fire in the small stone fireplace. His fingers were stiff and clumsy as he struck a match, but soon a small flame caught on the kindling he'd left prepared. With the promise of warmth on the way, he returned to the woman's side. Her breathing was so shallow he could barely detect it, and her skin remained frighteningly cold to the touch. Asher knew that if he didn't act quickly, she wouldn't survive the night. He removed her sodden boots and stockings, then rubbed her feet briskly between his hands. He did the same with her hands, noting with concern that her fingertips had a bluish tint. Next, he piled every blanket he owned on top of her, but it wasn't enough. Her body was too cold to generate its own heat. Asher had heard tales of trappers and mountain men who survived extreme cold by sharing body heat, and though he hesitated at the impropriety, he knew he had no choice. This woman's life depended on it. "Forgive me, miss," he murmured as he removed his wet outer clothes, leaving on his long underwear for decency's sake. He slid under the blankets beside her, pulling her cold body against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, rubbing her back and arms to stimulate circulation. Her breathing remained alarmingly faint, and Asher felt a surge of desperation. Leaning close to her face, he breathed warm air over her blue-tinged lips, then gently covered her mouth with his own and exhaled softly, sharing the warmth of his breath with her. "Come on," he whispered against her cold lips. "Breathe, damn it. Live." He continued this way for what seemed like hours, alternating between rubbing her limbs and breathing warm air into her lungs, all while keeping her pressed close to his body for warmth. The fire in the hearth grew stronger, gradually heating the small cabin, but Asher remained focused solely on the woman in his arms. Finally, when he was beginning to lose hope, he felt her stir slightly against him. A soft moan escaped her lips and her eyelids fluttered. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Come back now." Her eyes opened a startling shade of green that reminded Asher of spring meadows, and she gazed up at him in confusion. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're safe," Asher assured her. "I found you in the snow. You're in my cabin now, outside of St. George." She seemed to process this information slowly, her eyes drifting closed again as exhaustion claimed her. Asher continued to hold her, monitoring her breathing and the gradual warming of her skin. Only when he was certain she was sleeping naturally rather than unconscious did he allow himself to relax slightly. As the storm raged outside, Asher Young kept vigil over the mysterious woman he'd rescued, unaware that their lives had become irrevocably intertwined by the cruel winter and a twist of fate. When morning came, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white that glittered in the weak winter sunlight. Asher woke with a start, momentarily disoriented to find himself on the floor wrapped in a single blanket. Then he remembered he had moved there during the night once the woman's condition had stabilized, propriety finally overcoming necessity. He rose quietly and added wood to the banked fire, coaxing it back to life. Then he turned to check on his unexpected guest. She was still sleeping, her breathing now deep and regular, and some color had returned to her cheeks. Her dark hair, now dry, spread across his pillow in waves, framing a face that Asher couldn't help but notice was strikingly beautiful. As if sensing his gaze, her eyes fluttered open, and she stared at him in confusion before memory seemed to return. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice still weak but clear. Asher nodded, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance. "Found you half buried in the snow during the storm. Nearly didn't see you." She attempted to sit up but winced and fell back against the pillows. "Everything hurts," she murmured. "That's the frostbite talking," Asher explained, moving to fetch a cup of water from the bucket he kept near the fire. "You were nearly gone when I found you. Your body's remembering how to feel now." She accepted the water gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she brought the cup to her lips. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Young." "Asher Young," he supplied, taking the empty cup from her. "And you are Eleanor Zimmerman," she replied. "I was traveling to St. George when our stagecoach overturned in the storm. The driver said we were close enough to town that we should try to walk there, but I became separated from the others in the blizzard." Asher frowned. "Fool decision by that driver. St. George is still a good 5 miles from where I found you." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "The others, do you think they made it?" "Hard to say," Asher answered honestly. "Storm like that takes plenty of lives, but folks around here are hardy, and if they found shelter, they might have survived." She nodded soberly, then looked around the cabin. It was a simple one-room affair with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a small cupboard for provisions, and the bed she currently occupied. A few personal items adorned the walls: a Winchester rifle, a battered hat, and a framed daguerreotype of an older couple who shared Asher's strong jawline. "I've taken your bed," Eleanor realized with dismay. "Don't trouble yourself about that," Asher said, moving to the stove to prepare a simple breakfast. "You needed it more than I did." As he set about making coffee and frying up salt pork, Eleanor watched him thoughtfully. "You risked your life to save a stranger," she observed. "Not many would have done that," Asher shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Couldn't just leave you there. How exactly did you?" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "When I was so cold, how did you?" Asher's cheeks reddened slightly. "Had to warm you up quick. Used body heat and, well, breathed warm air into you. Hope you'll forgive the liberty, but there wasn't much choice." To his surprise, Eleanor smiled faintly. "I'm hardly in a position to object to methods that saved my life, Mr. Young." As he brought her a plate of food, Asher noticed she was still pale, and her hands trembled with the effort of holding the fork. "You need more rest," he observed. "And I need to check on my livestock. Think you'll be all right alone for a bit?" Eleanor nodded. "I'm sure I'll be fine. I don't think I could go anywhere even if I wanted to." After Eleanor had eaten what she could, Asher bundled up and ventured outside to tend to his small herd of cattle and check on Maverick. The snow was piled high against the cabin, and he had to shovel a path to the barn. Inside, he found Maverick and the other animals had weathered the storm well, though they were clearly eager for fresh feed and water. As he worked, Asher's thoughts kept returning to the woman in his cabin. Eleanor Zimmerman. He wondered what had brought her to St. George, a town that was little more than a trading post with a few scattered businesses and homes. Most folks passing through were either heading to the mining operations further west or driving cattle to the railheads. A refined-looking woman traveling alone was unusual, to say the least. When he returned to the cabin, he found Eleanor had drifted back to sleep. Her cheeks were flushed now, and Asher felt a spike of concern as he laid a hand on her forehead. She was burning with fever. "Damn it," he muttered. This was a complication he'd feared sometimes, when the body warmed too quickly after extreme cold. Fever set in as a reaction. He dampened a cloth with cool water and placed it on her forehead, then set about preparing a tea from the willow bark he kept for his own occasional headaches. When the tea was ready, he gently roused Eleanor. "Need you to drink this," he said, supporting her head as he held the cup to her lips. "It'll help with the fever." She grimaced at the bitter taste but drank obediently. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," she whispered. "No burden," Asher assured her, though in truth he was worried. The nearest doctor was in St. George, and in these conditions the journey would be treacherous at best, impossible at worst. He would have to manage her care himself and pray the fever broke quickly. Throughout the day, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words Asher couldn't quite catch. He kept replacing the cool cloth on her forehead and encouraged her to drink water whenever she was lucid enough. As night fell, her condition worsened. She began to thrash in the bed, calling out names and pleading with unseen figures. Asher sat beside her, holding her hand and speaking in low, soothing tones, though he doubted she could hear him. "Stay with me, Eleanor," he urged, surprised by the depth of his concern for this woman he barely knew. "You didn't survive that storm just to let fever take you now." In the midst of her delirium, Eleanor suddenly gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Don't let him find me," she begged, her eyes wide but unfocused. "Please, he'll take everything." Asher frowned, wondering who she feared. "No one's going to hurt you here," he promised. "You're safe." She seemed to calm at his words, her grip relaxing as she sank back into fevered sleep. Asher continued his vigil through the night, dozing occasionally in the chair he'd pulled up beside the bed but never leaving her side for long. By dawn, he was exhausted, but Eleanor's fever had finally broken. She slept peacefully now, her breathing regular and her skin cool to the touch. Asher allowed himself a moment of relief before rising to tend to the morning chores. When he returned, Eleanor was awake and sitting up in bed, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her green eyes clear and alert. "You look better," Asher observed, hanging his coat by the door. "I feel as though I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," she admitted with a weak smile. "But yes, I believe the worst has passed." Asher nodded, pleased. "Think you could manage some broth? Need to get your strength back." "That sounds wonderful," Eleanor agreed. She hesitated, then added, I believe I may have said some strange things during the fever. I hope I didn't alarm you." Asher busied himself with preparations for the broth, debating whether to mention her fearful words. "You were pretty out of it," he said finally. "Happens with fever." Eleanor seemed relieved by his casual response, though Asher couldn't help but wonder what or who she was running from. It wasn't his business, he told himself. Once she was well enough, he'd take her into town, and that would be the end of it. Yet even as he thought this, Asher realized he was in no particular hurry to see her go. Over the next few days, Eleanor grew stronger. She began to move around the cabin, first just to sit by the fire, then gradually taking on small tasks like peeling potatoes or mending a tear in one of Asher's shirts. They fell into an easy routine, sharing meals and stories as the winter world remained frozen outside. Asher learned that Eleanor had been raised in Boston, the daughter of a successful merchant who had ensured she received a proper education. She spoke of her childhood with fondness, but grew evasive when Asher inquired about her more recent past or her reasons for traveling west. "Sometimes a person just needs a fresh start," she said one evening as they sat before the fire, her fingers busy with embroidering a handkerchief she'd found in her salvaged carpet bag. "Isn't that why most people come west?" Asher couldn't argue with that. He'd come to Colorado 5 years earlier, after the war had left him restless and unable to settle back into the quiet farming life of his Indiana upbringing. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a trail driver, even briefly as a deputy in a mining town before saving enough to purchase his small spread outside St. George. "Fair enough," he conceded, watching the firelight play across her features. "We all have our reasons." As Eleanor's strength returned, Asher found himself increasingly drawn to her. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was her resilience, her quick wit, and the gentle way she had of listening when he spoke, as if his words truly mattered. On the 5th day after her rescue, Asher announced that if the weather held, he would ride into St. George the following morning to inquire about the stagecoach and its passengers. "I should come with you," Eleanor said, though Asher noted she didn't seem particularly enthusiastic about the prospect. "Still too risky," he countered. "Trails barely passable for a single rider. Besides, you're not fully recovered yet." Eleanor didn't argue, and Asher wondered if she was actually relieved. The question that had been nagging at him, why she seemed in no hurry to continue her journey, remained unasked. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Asher saddled Maverick and prepared for the ride to town, leaving Eleanor with strict instructions to rest and keep the fire going. "I'm not completely helpless, you know," she protested with a smile that made Asher's heart skip a beat. "Never thought you were," he replied, pulling on his gloves. Just don't want to have to rescue you from the snow a second time. Her expression softened. I don't think I've properly thanked you for the first time, Asher, not just for finding me, but for all you've done since. There was something in her voice, a warmth that hadn't been there before, that made Asher pause at the door. For a moment, he considered staying, postponing his trip to town. But practical matters couldn't be put off forever. Should be back by sundown, he said, tipping his hat to her before stepping out into the brilliant white morning. The ride to St. George was arduous, with Maverick having to navigate through deep drifts and patches of ice hidden beneath the snow. It was past noon when Asher finally reached the small settlement, which consisted of a general store, a saloon, a small church, a telegraph office, and a scattering of homes and businesses. His first stop was the general store, where the proprietor, a balding man named Morris, greeted him with surprise. "Asher Young, thought you might have frozen to death in that blizzard," Morris exclaimed, coming around the counter to clap him on the shoulder. "Nearly did," Asher admitted, stamping the snow from his boots. "Heard anything about a stagecoach that was caught in the storm. Would have been heading here from Denver." Morris's expression grew somber. "Bad business, that. Coach overturned about 5 miles out. Driver and 1 passenger made it to town, half dead from the cold. Another man was found frozen 2 miles from here. They're saying a female passenger is still missing, presumed dead." Asher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "The missing woman, her name Eleanor Zimmerman." Morris raised his eyebrows. "That's right, you know something about her." "She's alive," Asher said. "Found her in the snow and brought her to my place. She's been recovering there." "Well, I'll be damned," Morris muttered. "That's mighty good news. You should let Sheriff Blackburn know right away. There's been inquiries about her." A sense of unease settled over Asher. "What kind of inquiries?" "Man came through on the eastbound stage 2 days after the storm," Morris explained, lowering his voice though they were alone in the store. "Well-dressed fellow, offering a reward for information about Miss Zimmerman. Said he was her fiancé, concerned when she didn't arrive as expected." Asher frowned, remembering Eleanor's fevered words. "Don't let him find me." Could she have been referring to this supposed fiancé? "This man leave a name?" Asher asked casually. "Thornton, I believe. Victor Thornton. Left instructions at the telegraph office to contact him in Denver if she was found." Asher nodded, his mind racing. "I'll stop by the sheriff's office before I head back," he said, gathering the supplies he'd come for. "Need to stock up first, though. Been snowed in for days." After paying for his purchases and loading them into his saddlebags, Asher made his way to the sheriff's office. He found Sheriff Blackburn, a grizzled veteran of both the war and the frontier, warming his boots by the stove. "Young," the sheriff acknowledged with a nod. "Heard you found that missing woman from the stagecoach. News traveled fast in St. George." "Word gets around quick," Asher observed. "Yes, she's at my place, recovering. Was in bad shape when I found her, but she's doing better now." "Good to hear," Blackburn said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups and offering one to Asher. "Had a gentleman asking after her, seemed mighty concerned." "So Morris mentioned," Asher replied, accepting the coffee. "Said he claimed to be her fiancé." Something in Asher's tone must have betrayed his skepticism, for Blackburn gave him a shrewd look. "You have reason to doubt that." Asher sipped his coffee, considering his words carefully. "Miss Zimmerman hasn't mentioned any fiancé to me. In fact, she seemed troubled by something from her past." Blackburn leaned back in his chair. "Not unusual for folks heading west to be running from something or someone." "Has this Thornton fellow come back through town?" Asher asked. "Not yet, but he left word he'd return within the week." The sheriff studied Asher's face. Something on your mind, young? Asher set down his cup. Just thinking it might be best if Miss Zimmerman decided for herself whether she wants to be found by this man. Blackburn nodded slowly. I suppose that's fair enough. Trail to your place is still pretty treacherous anyway, wouldn't advise anyone to head out there just yet. Appreciate that, Sheriff, Asher said, rising to leave. I'll bring Miss Zimmerman to town myself once she's fully recovered and the trails are safer. As Asher rode back toward his cabin, the winter sun already beginning its early descent, his thoughts were troubled. Eleanor clearly had secrets, and now it seemed those secrets might have followed her to St. George. He had no right to interfere in her affairs, yet he couldn't ignore the fear he'd heard in her voice during her fever. By the time he reached the cabin, twilight was settling over the snow-covered landscape. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and when he pushed open the door, the aroma of cooking food greeted him. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring something in his cast-iron pot. She turned at his entrance, her face lighting up in a way that made Asher momentarily forget his concerns. I was beginning to worry, she said. It's getting dark. Trail's still rough, Asher explained, hanging up his coat and hat. Took longer than I expected. He set his saddlebags on the table and began unpacking the supplies. Eleanor moved to help him, her fingers brushing his as she took a package of coffee from his hands. Did you learn anything about the others from the stagecoach? Asher hesitated, then decided on honesty. Driver and one passenger made it to town. Another man was found dead. He paused. They thought you were dead too until I told them otherwise. Eleanor's expression was solemn but not particularly surprised. Poor Mr. Jenkins, she murmured. He was traveling to join his daughter in California. You're taking the news calmly, Asher observed. She shrugged slightly. I've learned that dwelling on what can't be changed only adds to one's burdens. She returned to the stove, lifting the lid on the pot. I hope you don't mind that I started supper. You had some venison in your cold storage and I found vegetables. Smells wonderful, Asher assured her, but his mind was still on what he'd learned in town. Eleanor, he began, choosing his words carefully, there's something else you should know. She looked up, a wariness entering her eyes. A man has been asking about you in town. Says he's your fiancé, Victor Thornton. Eleanor went very still, the color draining from her face. She gripped the edge of the stove so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Victor is here, she whispered. He passed through after the storm, Asher said, watching her closely. Left word he'd be back within the week. Eleanor turned away, but not before Asher glimpsed the naked fear in her expression. She stood rigid by the stove, her shoulders tense. He's not really your fiancé, is he? Asher asked gently. After a long moment, Eleanor shook her head. No, she admitted, her voice barely audible. But he wanted me to be. He doesn't take rejection well. Asher moved closer, careful not to crowd her. You're running from him. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. Yes. After my father died last spring, Victor, who had been my father's business partner, proposed marriage. When I refused, he became insistent. Said that with my father gone, I needed a man to look after me and my inheritance. And when you kept refusing. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes haunted. He made it clear I didn't really have a choice. Strange accidents began happening around me. A runaway carriage nearly struck me. There was a fire in my bedroom that the servants barely contained in time. Nothing could ever be traced to Victor, of course. He's too clever for that. Asher felt a surge of anger on her behalf. So you fled. I sold what I could secretly, enough to start a new life somewhere he wouldn't think to look. St. George seemed remote enough, and I'd heard there was need for a schoolteacher. She gave a bitter laugh. I should have known he would track me. Victor doesn't give up what he considers his property. You're not property, Asher said firmly, "and you don't have to face him if you don't want to." Eleanor searched his face. "What do you mean?" Sheriff Blackburn agreed not to mention that I found you, at least for now. The trail to my place is still dangerous enough that no one will be coming out here anytime soon. Asher took a breath. "You can stay here until you decide what you want to do next." Relief washed over Eleanor's features, followed quickly by uncertainty. "I couldn't impose on you any further. You've already done so much. It's no imposition," Asher interrupted. "Truth is, I've enjoyed having you here." He felt heat rise to his face at this admission but pressed on. "Besides, you're still recovering. Wouldn't be right to send you off on your own just yet." Eleanor's smile was tentative but genuine. "Thank you, Asher. I don't know what I would have done if—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. They both knew that if Asher hadn't found her in the snow that night, Victor Thornton would be arranging her funeral now instead of searching for her. As they sat down to the meal, Eleanor had prepared venison stew that was far more flavorful than Asher's usual fare. A comfortable silence settled between them. For the first time since arriving at his cabin, Eleanor seemed truly at ease, the immediate threat of discovery temporarily lifted. Later, as they sat before the fire, Asher found himself telling Eleanor about his own past, his childhood in Indiana, his service during the war, and his journey west in search of a place where the memories didn't press so heavily upon him. "You ever miss it?" Eleanor asked. "Your home, your family," Asher considered the question. "Miss my parents, sure, they write when they can. But that life farming the same fields my grandfather plowed, it wasn't for me, especially not after what I'd seen during the war. And here, have you found what you were looking for?" Asher looked around the small cabin that had been his home for the past 3 years. It wasn't much, but it was his. "Most days, I reckon I have. It's a hard life, but an honest one. No one telling me what to do or how to live." He glanced at her. "What about you? Before all this trouble with Thornton, what kind of life did you want?" Eleanor's gaze was distant. "I always thought I'd follow in my mother's footsteps. She was a teacher before she married my father. Books were my escape growing up. Father wanted me to make a suitable marriage, of course, but he never forced the issue. After he died." She trailed off. "I just want the freedom to choose my own path." "Seems like a reasonable wish," Asher said. Eleanor smiled sadly. "You would think so, wouldn't you? But men like Victor believe women are meant to be possessed, not partnered." Asher found himself reaching for her hand, almost without thinking. "Not all men think that way," he said softly. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding and possibility that made Asher's heart race. Eleanor's fingers tightened around his briefly before she withdrew her hand, a flush coloring her cheeks. "It's getting late," she murmured, rising from her chair. "And you've had a long ride today." Asher nodded, aware that whatever moment they'd shared had passed, at least for now. "You take the bed," he insisted, as he had every night since her fever broke. "I'm fine on my bedroll by the fire." Eleanor didn't argue, though Asher thought he detected a flicker of something disappointment, perhaps, in her eyes before she turned away. As he settled onto his bedroll later, listening to the soft rhythm of Eleanor's breathing from across the room, Asher acknowledged to himself what he'd been reluctant to admit. He was falling in love with Eleanor Zimmerman. And if the way she sometimes looked at him was any indication, she might be developing feelings for him as well. But with Victor Thornton's shadow hanging over them, Asher knew that any future they might have together was far from certain. The days that followed settled into a comfortable pattern. Asher tended to his livestock and made repairs around the property, while Eleanor kept the cabin in order and prepared meals that were a vast improvement over Asher's basic cooking. In the evenings, they talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams, gradually learning the contours of each other's lives. Asher discovered that Eleanor had a quick mind and a surprising knowledge of literature, history, and even politics. She could discuss the merits of Emerson's essays one moment and debate the implications of the recent presidential election the next. Her education far surpassed his own, yet she never made him feel inferior for it. For her part, Eleanor seemed fascinated by Asher's practical skills and his stories of life on the frontier. She insisted on learning to chop wood, though her first attempts were comically ineffective, and even asked him to teach her to shoot his revolver. "A woman alone needs to know how to protect herself," she explained as they stood behind the cabin. Asher positioning her arms to aim at an old tin can set on a fence post. "Can't argue with that," Asher agreed, trying to ignore how right it felt to stand close behind her, his hands guiding hers on the weapon. "Steady now. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger." Eleanor's shot went wide, but she was undeterred. By the end of the lesson, she had managed to hit the can twice, her face flushed with triumph. "Not bad for a city girl," Asher teased, enjoying the way her eyes sparkled with pride. "Next time I'll hit it 3 times," she declared, handing the revolver back to him with newfound confidence. As another week passed, the snow began to melt, turning the landscape into a slushy, muddy mess that would soon give way to spring. With the improved weather came an unspoken tension. They both knew that soon the trails would be clear enough for travel, and Eleanor would have to make a decision about her future. Asher rode into town again, ostensibly for supplies but also to gather information. Sheriff Blackburn informed him that Victor Thornton had indeed returned to St. George and was now staying at the small hotel above the saloon. "Man's offering a substantial reward now," Blackburn said, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. "Says Miss Zimmerman is mentally unsound and in need of medical attention. Claims her father's death unhinged her mind, made her flee from those trying to help her." Asher felt a surge of anger. "That's a lie. She's perfectly sound." Blackburn gave him a measuring look. "Figured as much." "Man seems too slick by half." He leaned forward. "Word of advice, young, if you're planning to keep that woman hidden away at your place, you'd best be careful. Thornton's hired a couple of local men to start searching the outlying areas. Won't be long before they come knocking." Asher thanked the sheriff for the warning and completed his errands quickly, eager to return to the cabin and warn Eleanor. As he rode, he considered their options. They could try to leave the area entirely, perhaps head further west. But with the spring thaw making the trails treacherous in different ways, travel would be difficult. Besides, running would only postpone the inevitable. Thornton had the resources to keep searching, and Eleanor deserved a chance to live openly, not constantly looking over her shoulder. When Asher reached the cabin, he found Eleanor outside, hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 pines. The sight of her domestic presence on his property stirred something deep within him, a longing for this arrangement to be permanent rather than temporary. She turned at the sound of Maverick's hooves, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Her smile of greeting faded as she read the concern on Asher's face. "He's in town, isn't he?" she asked as he dismounted. Asher nodded grimly. "And he's spreading lies about you, claiming you're mentally unstable, that you need to be returned to his care for your own good." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Of course he is. It's the perfect story. Who would question a concerned fiancé trying to help his troubled betrothed?" She looked up at Asher, her expression resolute. "I won't go back with him, Asher. I'd rather die." The fierceness in her voice matched the determination in her eyes, and Asher knew she meant every word. "It won't come to that," he promised, "but we need to think carefully about what to do next." Thornton's hired men to search the area. They'll find this place eventually. Eleanor nodded, processing this information. Then we need a plan. They moved inside, where Asher laid out what he'd learned in town. Thornton had established himself as a respectable businessman concerned for his missing fiancé. He'd made donations to the church, bought rounds of drinks at the saloon, and generally ingratiated himself with the townspeople. Few would question his story or his right to reclaim Eleanor. The simplest solution would be for you to move on, Asher suggested, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. I could take you to the railroad at Grand Junction. From there, you could head to California or Oregon, somewhere Thornton might not think to look. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. Running again, she said softly. Always running. She looked up at Asher, a new resolve in her expression. No, I'm tired of being afraid of letting Victor dictate my life. There must be another way. Asher hesitated, then voiced the thought that had been growing in his mind during the ride home. There is one possibility, he said slowly. If you were married to someone else, Thornton's claims would hold no weight. A husband's rights would supersede those of a supposed fiancé. Eleanor's eyes widened as she grasped his meaning. You're suggesting a marriage of convenience. It wouldn't have to be permanent, Asher hastened to add, though the idea of a temporary arrangement with Eleanor was not what his heart truly wanted. Just long enough to establish your independence from Thornton. Once he gives up and leaves the territory, you could seek an annulment if you wished. And you would be willing to do this? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. To marry me simply to thwart Victor? Asher met her gaze steadily. I would, he said. Then, gathering his courage, he added, though I should be honest with you, Eleanor, my reasons wouldn't be entirely selfless. A flush crept up her neck. What do you mean? Asher took a deep breath. I've grown fond of you more than fond. I know it's been a short time, and that this isn't how most folks court, but I care for you, Eleanor, deeply. The silence that followed his declaration seemed to stretch for an eternity. Eleanor's expression was unreadable, and Asher began to fear he'd overstepped, ruined the friendship they'd built. Then, to his surprise, Eleanor rose from her chair and came to kneel before him, taking his hands in hers. Asher Young, she said, her voice steady despite the tears that glimmered in her eyes. You saved my life that day in the snow, and every day since. You've shown me what a good man truly is. I would be honored to be your wife, not just to escape Victor, but because I've fallen in love with you too. Joy surged through Asher, so intense it was almost painful. You have? He asked, scarcely believing what he was hearing. Eleanor's smile was radiant. How could I not? You're kind and brave and honest, everything Victor pretends to be but isn't. When I'm with you, I feel safe, but more than that, I feel seen, for who I truly am. Unable to contain his emotions any longer, Asher pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the tenderness and passion he'd been restraining for weeks. Eleanor responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Asher rested his forehead against hers. We'll need to go to town tomorrow, he said. Find the preacher and make this official before Thornton's men discover you're here. Eleanor nodded, though a flicker of apprehension crossed her face. Victor won't give up easily, even if we're married. He's not accustomed to losing. Let him try, Asher said with quiet determination. You're not alone anymore, Eleanor. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That night, propriety was maintained one last time, with Asher sleeping on his bedroll while Eleanor took the bed. But there was a new understanding between them, an acknowledgement of the deeper feelings that had grown amidst the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting. As dawn broke the next morning, they prepared for the journey into St. George. Eleanor wore her original traveling dress, now cleaned and mended, while Asher donned the closest thing he had to formal attire, a clean shirt, and the vest he'd worn only twice since purchasing it. "How do I look?" Eleanor asked nervously, pinning her hair up in a simple but elegant style. Asher gazed at her, struck anew by her beauty. "Like the finest thing I've ever seen," he said honestly. Her smile was worth every hardship he'd endured to find her that stormy night. The ride into town was tense but uneventful. They took a circuitous route, avoiding the main trail in case Thornton's men were patrolling it. When they reached the outskirts of St. George, Asher suggested they head directly to the small white church that served the community. "Reverend Collins knows me," he explained. "He's a good man, not likely to be swayed by Thornton's money." The church was empty when they arrived, but they found Reverend Collins in the small house adjacent to it. The elderly preacher greeted Asher warmly before turning curious eyes to Eleanor. "This must be the young lady I've heard so much about," he said, extending a hand to her. "Though the descriptions circulating in town hardly do you justice, my dear." Eleanor shook his hand, her expression cautious. "I believe you may have heard some untruths about me, Reverend." "Indeed," Collins agreed, ushering them inside. "And I've lived long enough to recognize when a man's concern masks something darker. Now, what brings you to my door this morning?" Asher explained their situation and their desire to marry immediately. The Reverend listened without interruption, his weathered face thoughtful. "Marriage is not a step to be taken lightly," he said when Asher had finished, "even when there are practical reasons for haste." "We understand that, sir," Eleanor assured him. "But my feelings for Asher are sincere, as are his for me. The circumstances of our meeting may have been unusual, but what has grown between us is genuine." Collins studied them both, his kind eyes seeming to peer into their hearts. Finally, he nodded. "I believe you, child. And I'll be pleased to perform the ceremony. But first, we should have witnesses. This union must be beyond legal reproach if it's to protect you." He suggested they ask Sheriff Blackburn to serve as one witness, and perhaps Morris from the general store as another. Both men were well respected in the community, and their presence would lend legitimacy to the marriage. While the Reverend prepared the church, Asher went to find the sheriff, leaving Eleanor in Collins's protective custody. He located Blackburn at his office and explained the situation succinctly. "So you're marrying her," the sheriff said, a hint of amusement in his gruff voice. "Can't say I'm surprised. Saw the way you bristled when Thornton came asking about her." "Will you stand witness?" Asher asked. Blackburn nodded. "Be honored to. And I'll keep an eye out for Thornton while you're at the church. Man's been drinking heavily at the saloon since last night. Might be a blessing if he sleeps through your wedding." Morris also readily agreed to serve as a witness, closing his store temporarily to accompany Asher back to the church. By mid-morning, everything was arranged, and Asher found himself standing before the altar, watching as Eleanor walked down the short aisle toward him. She carried a small bouquet of early spring flowers that Mrs. Collins had hastily gathered from her garden, and though there had been no time for a wedding gown, Asher thought Eleanor had never looked more beautiful than she did in that moment, her face alight with certainty and love. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Asher kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that belied the urgency of their circumstances. Sheriff Blackburn and Morris applauded, and for a moment, the shadow of Victor Thornton seemed far away indeed. After signing the marriage certificate and accepting congratulations from their witnesses, Asher and Eleanor prepared to return to the cabin. They would need to gather supplies while in town, as Asher had suggested they might want to lie low for a week or so until Thornton gave up and left the area. They were just leaving the church when a commotion in the street caught their attention. A well-dressed man was striding toward them, flanked by two rough-looking individuals. Even before Eleanor stiffened beside him, Asher knew who it was. Victor Thornton was exactly as Asher had imagined him: tall, handsome in a calculated way, with cold eyes that belied his outwardly pleasant demeanor. He stopped short at the sight of Eleanor, a series of emotions flashing across his face: surprise, relief, and then a calculating anger that he quickly masked. "Eleanor, my darling," he called, moving forward with his arms outstretched. "Thank God you're safe. I've been out of my mind with worry." Eleanor pressed closer to Asher's side, her hand finding his and gripping it tightly. "Hello, Victor," she said, her voice steady despite the fear Asher could feel trembling through her. "As you can see, I'm perfectly well." Thornton's gaze shifted to Asher, assessing and dismissive in a single glance. "And who might this be? The local who found you, I presume. You have my gratitude, sir, for returning my fiancé to safety." Before Asher could respond, Sheriff Blackburn stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between the two parties. "This here's Asher Young," he said, his hand resting casually near his holstered gun. "And that lady ain't your fiancée, Thornton. She's his wife." Thornton's carefully composed expression faltered. "Wife," he repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. "That's absurd. Eleanor and I have been engaged for months. This is clearly some kind of misunderstanding, or worse, a deception." "No deception," Reverend Collins interjected mildly, emerging from the church with the marriage certificate in hand. "I've just performed the ceremony myself, with these good men as witnesses. Mr. and Mrs. Young are legally wed in the eyes of God and the territory of Colorado." Thornton's face darkened, his pretense of concern slipping to reveal the rage beneath. "This is preposterous. Eleanor is not in her right mind. She's been unwell since her father's death. Whatever she's told this man, whatever she believes herself, she's not capable of consenting to marriage." "I am perfectly sane, Victor," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now. "I was never your fiancé, and I never will be. I've chosen Asher as my husband, and there's nothing you can do to change that." Thornton's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. With the sheriff, the reverend, and the storekeeper all clearly supporting Eleanor and Asher, he was outnumbered in more ways than one. "You'll regret this," he said softly, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "When the novelty of playing frontier wife wears off, when you're tired of living in some dirt floor shack with a man who can barely sign his own name, you'll wish you'd made a different choice." Asher felt a surge of anger at the insult, but Eleanor's response was swift and cutting. "I would rather live in a humble cabin with a man of honor than in a palace with a snake," she said, her chin raised defiantly. "My father saw through you at the end, Victor. Why do you think he changed his will?" Something dangerous flashed in Thornton's eyes. "Your father was a foolish old man who didn't know what was best for his own daughter or his business. And yet he had the wisdom to ensure you couldn't touch my inheritance," Eleanor replied. "It's over, Victor. Go back to Boston. There's nothing for you here." For a tense moment, Asher thought Thornton might lash out physically. His hands clenched at his sides, and the two men with him shifted uneasily, awaiting instructions. But Sheriff Blackburn's steady presence and the growing crowd of onlookers seemed to give him pause. "This isn't finished," Thornton said at last, his voice cold with promise. "Not by a long shot." He turned and stalked away, his hired men following reluctantly behind. Eleanor sagged against Asher once Thornton was out of sight, the confrontation having drained her momentary courage. "He won't give up," she whispered. "You don't know him like I do." "Maybe not," Asher agreed, his arm tightening protectively around her waist. But he doesn't know me either. And I meant what I said in those vows, Eleanor. For better or worse, we're in this together now. Sheriff Blackburn approached them, his expression serious. Best get your business in town done quickly and head back to your place, he advised. I'll keep an eye on Thornton, but I can't arrest him for making threats unless he actually does something. Asher nodded his understanding. We'll be careful. They completed their errands efficiently, purchasing enough supplies to last a couple of weeks. Morris insisted on giving them a small wedding gift, a bolt of pretty calico fabric that made Eleanor's eyes light up despite the tension of the day. For curtains or a new dress, he said with a wink. Every bride should have something new for her home. By early afternoon, they were on their way back to the cabin, Maverick carrying their supplies while Eleanor rode behind Asher, her arms wrapped securely around his waist. The physical closeness was new, and Asher was acutely aware of her presence against his back, her breath warm against his neck. "Are you all right?" he asked over his shoulder as they put some distance between themselves and St. George. "Yes," Eleanor replied, tightening her hold on him slightly. Seeing Victor was difficult, but standing up to him, having you beside me, it felt like the first time I've truly been free of his shadow. Asher smiled, though she couldn't see it. "You were magnificent, reminded me of a she-bear defending her cubs." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and genuine against the backdrop of the melting wilderness. "Hardly a flattering comparison, Mr. Young." "Mrs. Young," he corrected, enjoying the way the words felt in his mouth, "and I meant it as high praise. She-bears are fierce protectors, loyal to what's theirs." They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in thoughts of the day's events and the strange, wonderful path that had brought them together. When the cabin came into view, Asher felt a curious sense of homecoming, different from before. Now it wasn't just his cabin, it was theirs. As he helped Eleanor dismount, he found himself strangely shy, aware that the nature of their relationship had fundamentally changed. They were no longer simply a rescuer and the woman he'd saved, nor even friends sharing temporary quarters. They were husband and wife with all that entailed. Eleanor seemed to sense his hesitation, for she reached up to touch his cheek gently. "We've done everything backward, haven't we?" she said with a small smile. "Most people court, then marry, then live together. We've reversed the entire process." Asher covered her hand with his own. "Does that bother you?" "No," she said simply. "I think perhaps it's better this way. We've seen each other at our worst and most vulnerable already. There's an honesty in that." Asher nodded, relieved by her understanding. "Still, I want to do right by you, Eleanor. This marriage may have happened quickly, but that doesn't make it any less real to me." "Nor to me," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to press a soft kiss to his lips. "Now, shall we go inside? I believe we have a wedding night to consider." Her boldness surprised and delighted him, and Asher found himself laughing as he swept her up into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home. The days that followed were a revelation for both of them. They settled into married life with a naturalness that belied the unusual circumstances of their union. Eleanor transformed the cabin with small touches, curtains made from the calico Morris had given them, wildflowers arranged in a tin can on the table, a braided rug she crafted from old fabric scraps Asher had been saving for patches. For his part, Asher found himself working with renewed purpose, making improvements to the cabin he'd long postponed. He built a proper chair for Eleanor, crafted shelves for her few books and personal items, and began planning an addition that would give them more space, as their family grew, a possibility they had begun to discuss in the quiet intimacy of their nights together. Their physical relationship had blossomed naturally. passion tempered by tenderness, and a deep respect that made each encounter an affirmation of their growing love. Asher, who had known his share of women in his wandering years but had never given his heart, found in Eleanor a partner who matched him in desire and exceeded him in emotional courage. "I never thought I could feel this way," he confessed one night as they lay entwined, the fire casting golden shadows across their skin. "Like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Eleanor traced the scar on his shoulder, a remnant from the war. "I feel the same," she murmured. "It's strange, isn't it? If that storm hadn't come, if you hadn't found me, our paths might never have crossed." "I'd have found you somehow," Asher said with certainty. "Maybe not in a snowdrift, but somewhere, some way." She smiled at his romantic declaration, so unlike the practical cowboy she'd first met. "I believe you would have." A week passed with no sign of Victor Thornton or his hired men. Asher made a quick trip to town for mail and news, returning with word from Sheriff Blackburn that Thornton had checked out of the hotel, but was still in the area, having taken rooms at a ranch owned by one of the wealthier cattle barons outside of town. "Sheriff says to keep our guard up," Asher told Eleanor as they ate supper that evening. "Thornton's been asking questions about me, about my property." Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite gone. "What kind of questions?" "How long I've been here, whether my claim to the land is secure, that sort of thing." Asher reached across the table to take her hand. "Don't worry. My paperwork's all in order, been paying my taxes regular. He won't find any legal angle there." Eleanor nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Victor doesn't always operate within the bounds of the law, Asher. He's careful, manipulative. He makes others do his dirty work while keeping his own hands clean." "We'll be vigilant," Asher promised. "I've loaded both rifles and my revolver." "And you've gotten pretty good with a gun yourself, Mrs. Young." This brought a smile back to Eleanor's face. "3 cans out of 5 yesterday," she reminded him proudly. "Better than most men I know," Asher agreed. "Between the two of us, we'll be fine." But despite his confident words, Asher took extra precautions in the days that followed. He made sure the horses were secured in the barn at night, checked and rechecked the locks on the doors and windows, and took to carrying his revolver even while working around the property. Spring was advancing rapidly now. The snow mostly melted except in shaded areas, and the first hints of green beginning to appear in the meadows surrounding the cabin. Asher and Eleanor started planning a garden, discussing what vegetables to plant and where to position them for the best sunlight. "I've never grown anything before," Eleanor admitted as they walked the property one mild afternoon, Asher pointing out potential garden sites. "In Boston, everything came from markets or was imported." "Nothing tastes better than vegetables you've grown yourself," Asher assured her. "My mother used to say that the secret ingredient in her cooking was the dirt under her fingernails." Eleanor laughed, a sound that still thrilled Asher every time he heard it. "I look forward to testing that theory." They were so engrossed in their planning that neither noticed the rider approaching until he was nearly upon them. Asher's hand went automatically to his revolver, but he relaxed slightly when he recognized one of Sheriff Blackburn's deputies. "Young," the deputy called, reining in his horse. "Sheriff sent me to warn you. Thornton's been stirring up trouble in town, claiming you coerced Miss Zimmerman, Mrs. Young, into marriage. Says he's got proof she was mentally unfit to consent." Asher felt Eleanor stiffen beside him. "What kind of proof?" he demanded. "Papers from some doctor back east, supposedly. Sheriff's skeptical, but Thornton's got Judge Wilson's ear. There's talk of an inquiry." "That's ridiculous," Eleanor burst out. "Any papers Victor has are forgeries. I've never been treated for any mental condition." The deputy looked uncomfortable. Sheriff thought you should know, in case Thornton tries to serve you with papers or something. Said to tell you he's doing what he can to slow things down, but the judge seems inclined to at least hear Thornton out. Thank you for the warning, Asher said grimly. Tell the sheriff we appreciate it. After the deputy departed, Eleanor paced the yard, her earlier contentment replaced by anxiety. This is exactly what I feared, she said. Victor is trying to invalidate our marriage to make it seem as though I was incapable of choosing you. Asher watched her, his own anger building at the man who continued to threaten their happiness. Is there anyone back in Boston who could vouch for your sanity? Your father's lawyer, perhaps, or family friends? Eleanor considered this. Father's attorney, Mr. Abernathy, certainly would. He helped me arrange my affairs before I left. And there's Dr. Landry, our family physician. He's known me since childhood and would never support Victor's claims. Could you telegraph them? Ask for statements or letters to counter Thornton's so-called evidence. Yes, Eleanor said, hope kindling in her eyes. Mr. Abernathy in particular would be outraged by Victor's tactics. He never trusted him, even when Father did. Then that's what we'll do, Asher decided. First thing tomorrow, we'll ride into town together and send those telegrams. Eleanor nodded, but then her expression faltered. What if it's a trap, Asher? What if Victor is expecting us to come to town where he might have more influence or support? It was a valid concern, one Asher had considered himself. We'll be careful, he promised. Go armed, stay in public spaces. The telegraph office is right across from the sheriff's office. If Thornton tries anything, we'll have witnesses and help close at hand. That evening, they drafted messages to be sent to Mr. Abernathy and Dr. Landry, explaining the situation succinctly and requesting written statements regarding Eleanor's mental faculties and the circumstances of her departure from Boston. They also composed a longer letter to Asher's parents in Indiana, sharing the news of their marriage and briefly explaining the unusual circumstances. I hope they won't think too poorly of me, Eleanor said as she helped Asher seal the letter. Marrying their son after knowing him such a short time, bringing trouble to his doorstep. They'll love you, Asher assured her. My mother's been after me to settle down for years. She'll be so pleased I've finally found a wife, she won't care about the details. Eleanor smiled, but Asher could see the worry that lingered in her eyes. He drew her into his arms, holding her close as they stood before the fire. It's going to be all right, he murmured into her hair. We're stronger together than Thornton is alone. Eleanor nodded against his chest, drawing comfort from his steadfast presence. I know, she whispered. I just wish we could be free of him for good. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for their journey into town. They set out early, Asher riding Maverick while Eleanor sat astride a gentle mare named Daisy that Asher had borrowed from a neighboring rancher shortly after their marriage. You look like you were born to ride, Asher observed as Eleanor guided Daisy confidently alongside Maverick. The weeks of good food and rest had restored her completely, and with color in her cheeks and strength in her limbs, she was a striking figure against the greening landscape. I took riding lessons as a girl, Eleanor explained. Though we only ever rode in the park, very properly on side saddles. This is much more exhilarating. They reached St. George without incident and headed straight for the telegraph office. The operator, a wizened older man named Jenkins, greeted them with friendly curiosity. Mrs. Young, is it now? He said to Eleanor. Heard about the wedding. Congratulations to you both. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, Eleanor replied with a warm smile. We have some important telegrams to send, if you please. As Jenkins counted out the words and calculated the cost, Asher kept a watchful eye on the street outside. There was no sign of Thornton or his men, but Asher wasn't about to let down his guard. They had just finished arranging for the telegrams when Sheriff Blackburn entered the office. "Thought I saw you two ride in," he said, nodding to Asher and tipping his hat to Eleanor. "Glad I caught you. Judge Wilson wants to see you both, said it wasn't a request." Asher exchanged a glance with Eleanor. "Is Thornton involved in this?" "He'll be there," Blackburn confirmed. "But so will I and Reverend Collins. The judge wants to sort this matter out once and for all." Eleanor squared her shoulders, a determined glint in her eye. "Then let's not keep him waiting. The sooner this is resolved, the sooner we can get on with our lives." The judge's chambers were located in a small building adjacent to the sheriff's office. When they arrived, Judge Wilson, a portly man with bushy side whiskers and piercing blue eyes, was seated behind a large desk. Victor Thornton occupied a chair to one side, looking immaculately dressed and supremely confident. Reverend Collins was also present, standing by the window with a concerned expression. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Young," the judge said, gesturing to two empty chairs. "Please be seated. We have a matter of some delicacy to discuss." Asher helped Eleanor to her chair before taking his own, keeping a wary eye on Thornton, who had merely nodded coldly in their direction. "I'll come straight to the point," Judge Wilson continued once they were settled. "Mr. Thornton here has raised serious concerns about the validity of your marriage. He claims that Miss Zimmerman, Mrs. Young," Eleanor interjected firmly. The judge cleared his throat. "Yes, well, that is the matter in question. Mr. Thornton claims that you were not mentally competent to consent to marriage due to the trauma of your father's death and subsequent difficulties." "That's a lie," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the anger Asher could see in the set of her shoulders. "I am perfectly sound of mind, as anyone who has spent more than 5 minutes in my company can attest." "Indeed," Reverend Collins spoke up. "I performed the marriage ceremony myself, Judge Wilson, and I found Mrs. Young to be articulate, clear-headed, and absolutely certain of her decision." Thornton leaned forward in his chair. "With all due respect, Reverend, you are not a medical professional. I have here sworn statements from Dr. Harold Freeman of the Boston Institute for Mental Wellness, detailing Eleanor's condition and treatment." He produced several official-looking documents, which the judge accepted and began to peruse. "I have never been treated by any Dr. Freeman," Eleanor protested. "I have never even heard of this institute. These papers are forgeries, Judge Wilson." "Denial is common in cases like hers," Thornton said smoothly. "Dr. Freeman notes in his assessment that Eleanor's condition manifests primarily as a rejection of reality, particularly regarding her engagement to me." Asher had heard enough. "This is absurd," he said, struggling to keep his tone respectful. "My wife has telegraphed her father's attorney and their family physician in Boston. Their responses will confirm that these claims are false." "Very convenient," Thornton remarked, "but I wonder, does Mrs. Young even know what she telegraphed today? In her state, she might believe she contacted legitimate sources when in fact, that's quite enough, Mr. Thornton," Sheriff Blackburn interrupted from his position by the door. "Are you suggesting Mrs. Young doesn't know her own mind even now?" "I am suggesting," Thornton replied, his voice hardening, "that she has been manipulated and taken advantage of by a man who found her in a vulnerable state and saw an opportunity to secure himself a wealthy wife." Asher half rose from his chair, fury coursing through him, but Eleanor's hand on his arm restrained him. "If I may speak, Judge Wilson," she said, her voice clear and controlled. "When my father died last year, he left his entire estate to me, with specific provisions that I should maintain sole control over my inheritance regardless of my marital status. Mr. Thornton, who had been my father's business partner, proposed marriage shortly thereafter. When I refused him, strange accidents began to occur, incidents that could never quite be traced back to him, but which clearly carried his warning. Judge Wilson frowned, looking from Eleanor to Thornton. "These are serious implications, Mrs. Young." "They are facts, Your Honor," Eleanor replied. "I fled Boston to escape Victor's increasingly dangerous attentions. I had no plan to marry anyone. My intention was to establish myself as a schoolteacher here in St. George. Meeting Asher, falling in love with him, these were unexpected gifts, not calculated decisions." "A touching story," Thornton said dismissively. "But the facts remain. Eleanor was found wandering alone in a blizzard, a behavior consistent with the delusional episodes documented in Dr. Freeman's reports. She was then secluded at Mr. Young's remote cabin for weeks before suddenly appearing in town to marry him. The circumstances are, at best, suspicious." "I wasn't wandering aimlessly," Eleanor countered. "The stagecoach overturned in the storm. The driver made a poor decision to try to walk to town, and I became separated from the others." "A convenient explanation," Thornton said. "But where are these other passengers to corroborate your story?" "Two survived," Sheriff Blackburn interjected. "The driver, Bill Hatcher, and a passenger named Thomas Green. They've both confirmed that the coach overturned and that Miss Zimmerman, Mrs. Young, was indeed a passenger." Thornton's confident expression faltered slightly at this information, but he quickly recovered. "That doesn't change the fact that Eleanor has a documented history of mental instability, making her incapable of consenting to marriage." Judge Wilson studied the papers before him with a frown. "These do appear to be in order, Mrs. Young. The Institute's letterhead, the doctor's credentials, they are forgeries," Eleanor insisted. "If you'll just wait for responses from Mr. Abernathy and Dr. Landry—" "I see no reason to delay," Thornton interrupted. "Eleanor needs proper care, which I am prepared to provide." "Our engagement, we were never engaged," Eleanor said firmly. "Should be honored," Thornton continued as if she hadn't spoken. "This hasty marriage to a virtual stranger should be annulled immediately." Judge Wilson looked troubled. "The law does require that both parties be of sound mind when entering into marriage. If there's legitimate doubt—" "There is no doubt about my wife's sanity," Asher said, unable to remain silent any longer. "This man is trying to control her because she had the courage to reject him. Everything about his story stinks of manipulation and lies." Before the judge could respond, there was a knock at the door, and Jenkins from the telegraph office entered, holding several slips of paper. "Begging your pardon, Judge," he said, "but these just came through for Mrs. Young. Marked urgent." Eleanor accepted the telegrams with trembling hands. As she read them, a smile spread across her face. She passed them to the judge without a word. Judge Wilson adjusted his spectacles and read aloud. "To Mrs. Eleanor Young, St. George, Colorado. I have been the Zimmerman family physician for 20 years and attended Eleanor from childhood. She has never suffered from any mental affliction whatsoever. Any claims to the contrary are false and slanderous. I am preparing a sworn affidavit to this effect to be sent by post. Regards, Dr. James Landry, Boston." The judge set that telegram aside and read the second. "To Mrs. Eleanor Young. As your late father's attorney and executor of his will, I can confirm you were of entirely sound mind when you left Boston. Your father's revised will specifically protected your inheritance from any future husband, a provision he added after expressing concerns about Victor Thornton's intentions toward you. I am dispatching legal documents by express mail to support your position. Thornton has no legitimate claim to you or your property. Abernathy, attorney at law." A heavy silence fell over the room. Thornton's face had gone pale, his confident demeanor crumbling as the telegrams exposed his deception. Judge Wilson removed his spectacles, fixing Thornton with a stern gaze. "Mr. Thornton, attempting to deceive this court is a serious offense. These telegrams cast significant doubt on the authenticity of your evidence." "Those could be forgeries themselves," Thornton blustered. "How do we know Young didn't arrange enough?" Judge Wilson said sharply. "Until I receive the promised documents from Boston, I see no reason to question the validity of the Young marriage. Sheriff, I suggest you keep a close eye on Mr. Thornton until this matter is fully resolved." "With pleasure, Judge," Blackburn replied, moving to stand closer to Thornton. Thornton's expression darkened, his mask of civility finally slipping to reveal the rage beneath. "This isn't over," he said, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you're giving up. This man, this Cowboy, can never provide the life you deserve." "He's already given me something you never could, Victor," Eleanor replied calmly. "Freedom to be myself and love without conditions." With a final glare at them both, Thornton stalked from the room, Sheriff Blackburn following close behind. Judge Wilson sighed, gathering the papers on his desk. "A most unpleasant business," he remarked. "Mrs. Young, Mr. Young, I apologize for any distress this inquiry may have caused. Based on what I've seen today, I have no reason to doubt the legitimacy of your marriage." "Thank you, Your Honor," Asher said, relief evident in his voice. Outside the judge's chambers, Eleanor sagged against Asher, the tension of the confrontation finally taking its toll. "It's over," she whispered. "He can't take me away from you." "No, he can't," Asher agreed, wrapping his arm around her waist to support her. "Let's go home, Mrs. Young." The ride back to their cabin was quiet, both of them processing the events of the day. Though they had triumphed in the judge's chambers, Asher couldn't shake the feeling that Thornton wasn't finished with them yet. The man's parting words had carried too much menace, too much certainty, to be mere bluster. His concerns proved justified that very night. They were awakened in the early hours by the frantic neighing of horses and a bright orange glow visible through the cabin's windows. "Fire!" Asher shouted, leaping from bed and pulling on his trousers. "The barn's on fire!" Eleanor was right behind him, throwing a shawl over her nightgown as they rushed outside. The barn was indeed ablaze, flames licking up the wooden walls and smoke billowing into the night sky. The animals inside were panicking, their terrified sounds spurring Asher to action. "Get the water bucket from the well," he called to Eleanor as he ran toward the barn doors. "And my rifle from beside the door there might be someone still around." Eleanor sprinted to the well, lowering the bucket as quickly as she could while keeping an eye on the surrounding darkness. The fire was too deliberate, too conveniently timed, to be an accident. Victor Thornton's vengeful hand was evident in this destruction. Asher managed to force open the barn doors despite the heat, disappearing into the smoke-filled interior. Eleanor's heart pounded with fear for him as she hauled up the water bucket. It would do little against the rapidly spreading flames, but it was all they had. She had just retrieved the rifle when Asher emerged from the barn, leading Maverick and Daisy, followed by 2 cows and a calf. The animals were wild-eyed with terror, but alive. "Is that all of them?" Eleanor called, rushing forward with the water bucket. "All that matter," Asher replied grimly, his face streaked with soot. "The barn's lost. We need to make sure the fire doesn't spread to the cabin." They worked together, dousing the ground between the barn and the cabin with water from the well, creating a barrier to prevent the flames from jumping. The heat was intense, and sparks floated on the night air, threatening to ignite the dry grass around them. As they fought to contain the blaze, A movement at the edge of the property caught Eleanor's eye. She raised the rifle, peering through the smoke. "Asher," she called, her voice tight with alarm. "Someone's out there." Asher turned, following her gaze. In the flickering light of the fire, they could make out 3 mounted figures observing the destruction from a safe distance. Even at this range, there was no mistaking Victor Thornton's erect posture on the center horse. "Bastard," Asher muttered, taking the rifle from Eleanor. "He's making sure we know who did this." Before he could take aim, the figures wheeled their horses around and disappeared into the darkness. Their message delivered. Thornton could touch them even here, even after his legal defeat. The barn burned through the night, despite their efforts to salvage what they could. By dawn, it was nothing but smoldering ruins, a blackened skeleton of charred beams and ash. The livestock, thankfully, were unharmed, though they would need to be temporarily penned in the corral until a new shelter could be built. As they surveyed the damage in the gray morning light, Eleanor slipped her hand into Asher's. "We're still here," she said softly. "We still have each other and the cabin and the animals. Victor didn't take what truly matters." Asher squeezed her hand, grateful for her strength. "No, he didn't. But I'm not willing to wait for his next attack." His expression hardened with resolve. "It's time to end this once and for all." Eleanor looked up at him, concern in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" "Thornton's staying at the Barkley Ranch outside of town," Asher said. "I'm going to pay him a visit, make it clear that if he ever comes near you or our property again, he'll regret it." "No," Eleanor said firmly, gripping his arm. "That's exactly what he wants, to provoke you into doing something rash, something that could get you arrested or killed." "His men were with him last night, Asher. 3 against 1 isn't a confrontation you can win." Asher's jaw clenched, but he knew she was right. Charging into Thornton's temporary stronghold would be foolhardy at best, suicidal at worst. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked. "We can't just wait for him to strike again." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We need to expose him publicly, make it impossible for him to continue his vendetta without consequences." Her eyes lit up as an idea took shape. "The documents from Mr. Abernathy should arrive soon. What if we arranged for them to be read publicly, perhaps at a town meeting? If everyone in St. George knows what kind of man Victor truly is, he won't be able to hide behind his respectable facade." Asher considered this. "Could work," he acknowledged. "Thornton values his reputation." "If we can damage that." "Exactly," Eleanor said, warming to her plan. "And if we can prove he was behind the fire, that would be even better. Sheriff Blackburn could arrest him for arson and attempted murder." "We'd need evidence for that," Asher pointed out. Eleanor's expression turned determined. "Then we'll find some. Victor is careful, but he's also arrogant. He believes he's smarter than everyone around him, which makes him careless in certain ways." Asher found himself smiling despite the destruction surrounding them. "You know, Mrs. Young, you're a formidable strategist when you put your mind to it." "I learned from the best," she replied. "My father always said that in business, you should never let your opponent know your next move until it's too late for them to counter it." They spent the morning securing the remaining livestock and salvaging what they could from the barn ruins. Then, after a quick meal, they rode into town together, heading straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Blackburn listened gravely as they reported the fire and their suspicions about Thornton's involvement. "Can't arrest a man on suspicion alone," he said when they'd finished. "But I can certainly keep a closer eye on him and his men. And if you're right about those documents from Boston providing evidence of his previous threats against Mrs. Young, that would establish a pattern of behavior." "When do you expect the express mail to arrive?" Asher asked. "Should be on tomorrow's stage if it was sent promptly," Blackburn replied. In the meantime, I'd suggest you both stay in town. I've got a spare room above the office you're welcome to use." Eleanor and Asher exchanged glances. Neither wanted to abandon their home, especially now when rebuilding the barn was a pressing necessity. But the sheriff's suggestion made tactical sense. They would be safer in town, and Thornton would be less likely to attempt anything with witnesses around. "We'll take you up on that offer, Sheriff," Asher decided, "just until we've dealt with Thornton one way or another." They spent the afternoon making arrangements, purchasing supplies to replace some of what was lost in the fire, speaking with Reverend Collins about the possibility of a town meeting, and sending telegrams to update Mr. Abernathy on recent developments. As they walked from the telegraph office to the sheriff's office, where they would spend the night, Eleanor suddenly clutched Asher's arm. "There," she said in a low voice, nodding toward the saloon across the street. Victor Thornton stood on the boardwalk, deep in conversation with one of the men who had accompanied him the night before. As they watched, Thornton handed the man something money, by the looks of it, and the man nodded before heading toward the livery stable. "I wonder what that's about," Asher murmured, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. "Nothing good," Eleanor replied, her grip on Asher's arm tightening. "Asher, I'm afraid, not for myself but for you. Victor won't stop until he's destroyed everything I care about." Asher covered her hand with his own. "He's welcome to try," he said grimly, "but he'll find I'm not so easily destroyed." They continued to the sheriff's office, both aware that Thornton had spotted them and was watching their progress with calculating eyes. The room above the sheriff's office was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Sheriff Blackburn had already brought in a cot for himself, insisting that he would sleep downstairs to give them privacy. "Lock the door," he instructed them. "I'm a light sleeper, but it doesn't hurt to be cautious." Alone in the room, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the past 24 hours finally overwhelming her. Asher sat beside her, pulling her close against his side. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So sorry that loving me has brought you all this trouble." Asher tilted her chin up, looking into her eyes with a steadfastness that made her heart ache with love for him. "Don't ever apologize for that," he said. "Finding you in that snow was the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor. I wouldn't trade what we have for anything, certainly not for a quiet life without you." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his unwavering belief in them. "When this is over," she said, "I want to start building a real life together, not just surviving Thornton's threats, but truly living." Asher kissed her forehead. "We will," he promised, "starting with a new barn, twice as good as the old one." Despite the tension of their situation, they slept soundly that night, secure in Sheriff Blackburn's guardianship and in each other's arms. The following morning, anticipation thrummed through the small room as they prepared for the day, knowing that the express mail and with it, the evidence they needed would arrive on the morning stage. They ate breakfast at the small cafe next to the general store, then made their way to the stagecoach stop. A small crowd had gathered, as was customary for the stage's arrival, and Eleanor felt exposed as they waited, certain that Thornton or his men might be watching from some hidden vantage point. When the stage finally rattled into view, dust billowing behind it, a collective murmur ran through the crowd. The driver pulled the team to a halt, jumping down to open the door for the passengers while his assistant began unloading mail and parcels from the boot. Sheriff Blackburn approached the assistant. "Any express packages for Mrs. Young?" he inquired. The man consulted a manifest. "Yes, sir. Got one here from Boston, marked urgent." Eleanor felt a surge of relief as the man handed over a thick envelope bearing the embossed letterhead of Abernathy and Sons. attorneys at law. "Thank you," she said, clutching the package to her chest like a shield. They retreated to the sheriff's office to examine the contents in private. Inside the envelope were several documents, sworn affidavits from Dr. Landry and Mr. Abernathy attesting to Eleanor's mental soundness, a copy of her father's will with the provisions protecting her inheritance highlighted, and most damning of all, a detailed account of the accidents that had befallen Eleanor after her refusal of Thornton's proposal, complete with witness statements suggesting Thornton's involvement. "This is exactly what we needed," Sheriff Blackburn said, scanning the documents with satisfaction. "Establishes a clear pattern of harassment and threat. Combined with the barn fire, if we can connect him to it, we've got enough to arrest Thornton on several serious charges." "And to expose him publicly," Eleanor added, thinking of their plan. "Everyone in St. George should know what kind of man he really is." Blackburn nodded thoughtfully. "Reverend Collins mentioned you were thinking of calling a town meeting." "Today's Wednesday. The Ladies' Aid Society meets at the church this afternoon. Most of the town's prominent citizens attend or have wives who do. Would be a good opportunity to make your case." "Perfect," Eleanor agreed, turning to Asher. "Will you speak with Reverend Collins, arrange for us to address the meeting?" "Of course," Asher said. "But you should be the one to present these documents, Eleanor. Your story, your voice." She nodded, drawing strength from his confidence in her. "I will. It's time I stopped running and faced Victor directly, on my own terms." While Asher went to speak with Reverend Collins, Eleanor remained at the sheriff's office, organizing the documents and preparing what she would say at the meeting. Sheriff Blackburn, meanwhile, sent his deputy to discreetly observe Thornton's movements and report back. When the deputy returned an hour later, his news was troubling. "Thornton's checked out of the Barkley Ranch," he reported. "Packed his bags and rode out with his men about an hour ago." "Did anyone see which way they went?" Blackburn asked, a frown creasing his weathered face. "Headed east, according to Mrs. Barkley. Said they were returning to Denver on urgent business." Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with the sheriff. "I don't believe it," she said. "Victor wouldn't leave without making one final attempt to harm us or take me back. This feels like a ruse." "I agree," Blackburn said grimly. "He wants us to lower our guard." He turned to his deputy. "Ride out to the Young place. Check if there's any sign of Thornton or his men lurking around. And be careful, they might be watching for someone to do exactly that." After the deputy departed, Eleanor paced the small office, anxiety making it impossible to sit still. "What if Victor's men attack Asher on his way back from the church?" she fretted. "I should have gone with him." "Asher can handle himself," Blackburn assured her. "And the church is just down the street, in full view of half the town. Even Thornton wouldn't try anything so brazen in daylight." As if summoned by their concern, Asher appeared at the door, looking relieved to find Eleanor safe. "All arranged," he reported. "Reverend Collins was more than willing to accommodate us. The meeting starts at 2 o'clock. Eleanor quickly shared what they'd learned about Thornton's apparent departure, and Asher's expression darkened. "It's a trap," he said flatly. "He wants us to think he's gone so we'll be less vigilant." "That's our thinking too," Blackburn agreed. "I've sent my deputy to check your property, but until we know more, you both should stay where people can see you." They spent the remaining hours before the meeting in the relative safety of the sheriff's office, watching the street through the window for any sign of Thornton or his men. When it was time to head to the church, Sheriff Blackburn accompanied them, his hand never far from his holster. The church was already filled with women of various ages when they arrived, with a few husbands and other male community members lingering at the back. Reverend Collins greeted them at the door, ushering them to seats near the front, while he called the meeting to order. After the usual business was concluded, the Reverend introduced Eleanor, explaining that she had important information to share with the community. As Eleanor moved to the front, documents in hand, she felt a momentary flutter of nerves. Then she caught Asher's encouraging gaze from the back of the room, and her resolve strengthened. "Many of you know me as the woman Asher Young found in the snow and later married," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Some of you may have also heard claims made by a man named Victor Thornton regarding my mental state and his supposed rights over me. Today, I want to tell you the truth." For the next 15 minutes, Eleanor laid out her story: her father's death, Thornton's unwelcome advances, the escalating threats that had driven her to flee Boston, and finally, his pursuit and continued harassment even after her marriage to Asher. She read excerpts from the affidavits and letters, passed the documents around for examination, and described the fire that had destroyed their barn just the night before. "Victor Thornton is not a jilted fiancé seeking reconciliation," she concluded. "He is a dangerous man who believes he has the right to control my life and my inheritance. He has brought violence to our community and threatened not only my freedom but my husband's life. I'm asking for your help to stop him before anyone else is harmed." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Eleanor could see shock and outrage on many faces, particularly among the women. Mrs. Collins, the Reverend's wife, stood up. "I, for one, believe every word Mrs. Young has said," she declared firmly. "No woman invents such threats, nor flees across the country without dire cause. We must stand with her against this man." Others voiced their agreement, and Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude for this show of support from people who were still, in many ways, strangers to her. Asher moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers in a gesture that spoke volumes about their partnership. The meeting was just concluding, with plans being made for a community patrol to watch for Thornton and his men, when the church doors burst open. Sheriff Blackburn's deputy stood in the entrance, breathless and disheveled. "Sheriff," he called. "Fire at the Young place again, not just the barn ruins this time, but the cabin too. And there's more. Thornton and his men were there, but they rode out when they saw me." Heading west toward the mountains, Asher's grip on Eleanor's hand tightened painfully. "The cabin," he repeated, his voice hollow. The deputy nodded grimly. "Burning fast when I left. I tried to douse what I could, but—" Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. Their home, the place where she had found safety and love after so much fear, was being destroyed by Victor's vindictive rage. "I'll go back with you," Sheriff Blackburn told Asher. "We'll save what we can." But Eleanor could see in Asher's eyes that his thoughts had already moved beyond the burning cabin. "No," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "You go to the cabin. I'm going after Thornton." "Asher, no," Eleanor protested. "It's too dangerous." "He has his men with him. This ends now," Asher cut her off, his expression set. "He's burned our home, threatened our lives. I won't let him escape to plan his next attack." Sheriff Blackburn looked torn. "Young, I understand how you feel, but taking the law into your own hands—" "I'm not planning to kill him," Asher interrupted. "Just bring him back to face justice for what he's done. You have all the evidence you need to charge him now." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right. But you're not going alone." He turned to the assembled townspeople. "I need volunteers, men who can ride and shoot, to go with Young and my deputy. This Thornton has terrorized our neighbors and set fire to their property. It's time we showed him that St. George takes care of its own." To Eleanor's surprise and relief, several men immediately stepped forward, including Morris from the general store and even Judge Wilson himself, who declared that, having seen the evidence, He was now convinced of Thornton's guilt. Asher turned to Eleanor, taking both her hands in his. "I have to do this," he said softly, for her ears alone. "I have to know you'll be safe." Eleanor's heart was torn between fear for his safety and understanding of his need to protect what was theirs. "I know," she whispered, "but please be careful. I couldn't bear to lose you now." "You won't," he promised, pressing a swift, fierce kiss to her lips before turning to join the men gathering at the church door. Eleanor watched him go, fighting the urge to run after him, to beg him to stay. Instead, she straightened her spine and turned to Mrs. Collins and the other women. "We should gather supplies," she said, channeling her worry into action. "Blankets, food, whatever might be needed for the men when they return, and for us if the cabin is lost." The community mobilized with impressive speed. While one group of men rode out with Asher in pursuit of Thornton, another accompanied Sheriff Blackburn to the Young property to battle the fire. The women organized supplies and set up a temporary shelter in the church basement for Eleanor and any other displaced persons. Eleanor kept busy, helping to prepare food and sort donations, but her thoughts were constantly with Asher. Had they caught up to Thornton yet? Was there a confrontation happening even now, somewhere in the foothills west of town? The questions tormented her, but she forced herself to remain focused on the tasks at hand. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. As twilight approached, Sheriff Blackburn returned to town, his face and clothes blackened with soot. "The cabin?" Eleanor asked, bracing herself for the worst. "Damaged, but not a total loss," Blackburn reported. "We managed to save the main structure, though the roof's partly gone and most of what was inside is smoke damaged or burned." Relief mingled with sorrow in Eleanor's heart. The cabin could be rebuilt, possessions replaced, but it still represented another violation, another attack on the life she and Asher were building together. "Any word from Asher and the others?" she asked. Blackburn shook his head. "Not yet, but they're good men, Mrs. Young. They'll bring Thornton back, one way or another." Night fell, and still no word came. Eleanor found herself unable to eat or rest, pacing the church basement where a cot had been set up for her. Mrs. Collins tried to persuade her to sleep, but every time Eleanor closed her eyes, she saw visions of Asher wounded or worse, of Thornton escaping to threaten them another day. It was past midnight when the sound of hoofbeats in the street drew everyone still awake to the church doors. Eleanor rushed outside, straining to see in the darkness illuminated only by a few lanterns and the moon above. A group of riders approached, led by Asher. Eleanor's heart leapt at the sight of him, apparently unharmed. Behind him, two more riders flanked a third, whose hands appeared to be bound to his saddle horn. "Thornton," Sheriff Blackburn muttered beside her. "They got him." Eleanor hardly registered his words, already running toward Asher as he dismounted. He caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of relief and triumph and homecoming all at once. "You're safe," she breathed against his neck, breathing in his scent of dust and sweat and horse. "I was so worried." "Told you I'd come back," he murmured, setting her down but keeping one arm firmly around her waist. "And I brought a gift." They turned to watch as Thornton was pulled roughly from his horse. The once immaculate businessman was now dirty and disheveled, with a darkening bruise on one cheek and a look of cold fury in his eyes. When he saw Eleanor, that fury intensified. "You'll regret this," he spat. "All of you." "I have connections. Influence, not anymore, you don't," Judge Wilson interrupted, stepping forward. "Victor Thornton, I'm remanding you to Sheriff Blackburn's custody on charges of arson, attempted murder, fraud, and harassment. You'll be held for trial, and given the evidence against you, I expect you'll be acquainted with the territorial prison for many years to come." As Thornton was led away, still hurling threats and imprecations, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden of fear she'd carried for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly free. "It's over," she said wonderingly, looking up at Asher. "He can't hurt us anymore." Asher nodded, his eyes reflecting the same relief and hope she felt. "We can rebuild now," he said. "Make a real life together without looking over our shoulders." In the days that followed, the people of St. George rallied around the Youngs with remarkable generosity. Men volunteered to help repair the cabin roof and rebuild the barn. Women provided meals and donated household items to replace what had been lost in the fire. Even Judge Wilson contributed, offering Asher a favorable loan to purchase additional cattle to expand his small herd. Victor Thornton was transferred to the territorial prison in Denver to await trial, his threats proving empty when telegrams to his supposed connections went unanswered. Mr. Abernathy wrote to inform Eleanor that Thornton's business dealings in Boston were being investigated following the revelations about his behavior, and his reputation there was in tatters. By the time summer arrived, the young homestead had been fully restored and improved. The new barn was larger and sturdier than the original, and the cabin now boasted an additional room that Asher had built with future children in mind. Eleanor had planted a garden that thrived in the rich Colorado soil, and she had begun offering reading lessons to neighboring children, the first step toward her dream of eventually opening a proper school. On a warm evening in June, Asher and Eleanor sat on the porch he had added to the front of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Eleanor's head rested on Asher's shoulder, her hand entwined with his. "I had news from Boston today," she said. "Mr. Abernathy has sold my father's house and transferred the proceeds to our bank in St. George, along with the remainder of my inheritance. We're quite wealthy now, apparently." Asher chuckled. "Doesn't change much out here. Still have cattle to tend, crops to plant, winters to prepare for." "No," Eleanor agreed with a smile. "But it does mean we could expand the ranch, perhaps hire some help, and I've been thinking about that school." "Whatever you want to do, I'm with you," Asher said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Though I hope it won't take you too far from home." "I've gotten used to having you around." Eleanor laughed, a sound that never failed to warm Asher's heart. "I've gotten rather used to being here too." She paused, then added softly, "especially now that there might be 3 of us before long." Asher went very still, slowly turning to look at her. "Eleanor, are you saying?" She nodded, her eyes shining with happy tears. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby, Asher. Next winter there will be a new young in this cabin." Joy surged through Asher, so intense it nearly robbed him of speech. He gathered Eleanor into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious materials on earth. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." Eleanor drew back to look into his eyes, her own expression radiant with love and hope. "I keep thinking about how we met, how close I came to freezing to death in that storm. If you hadn't found me, if you hadn't warmed me back to life with your own breath." "But I did find you," Asher said, cupping her cheek tenderly. "And every day since has been a gift I never expected but will always treasure." As the last light of day faded from the sky, Asher Young held his wife close on the porch of the home they had built together, marveling at the strange and wonderful path that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter in a deadly blizzard had sprung a love strong enough to withstand fire, threats, and the vindictive rage of a man who had sought to possess what could only be freely given. And now that love had created new life, a child who would be born into a home filled with warmth and laughter, and the unwavering certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. "I love you, Mrs. Young," Asher murmured as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And I love you, Mr. Young," Eleanor replied, her voice holding all the promise of their shared future. Now and always. In the years that followed, the Young family thrived in St. George. Their son, Samuel, was born on a crisp December morning, his father pacing anxiously outside the bedroom while Eleanor labored under the watchful care of Dr. Miller and several local women who had become dear friends. When at last Asher was allowed to enter, the sight of Eleanor cradling their newborn son brought tears to his eyes. The tiny boy had his mother's striking green eyes and, according to the doctor, his father's strong lungs, judging by his hearty cries upon entering the world. 2 years later, twins joined the family, a boy and girl named Michael and Margaret, who kept their parents busy with their mischievous antics and boundless energy. Eleanor managed to establish her school despite the demands of motherhood, teaching the children of St. George 3 days a week in a small building the community had helped construct near the church. Asher's ranch prospered, growing from a modest homestead to one of the more successful operations in the county. He hired 2 steady hands to help with the expanding herd, which gave him more time to spend with his family and to assist Eleanor with her educational endeavors. Victor Thornton, meanwhile, served 5 years in the territorial prison before being released and returning east, his health broken and his fortune depleted by legal fees and restitution. He never troubled the Youngs again, and Eleanor eventually came to think of him with pity rather than fear. On winter nights, when snow blanketed the land and the wind howled around their sturdy cabin, now expanded into a proper house with multiple bedrooms and a dedicated schoolroom, Asher and Eleanor would often reminisce about the blizzard that had brought them together. "You found me when I wasn't even looking for myself," Eleanor would say, nestled against Asher's chest before the fireplace. "And you breathed life back into me in more ways than one." Asher would smile, thinking of the unconscious woman he'd discovered half buried in the snow so many years before, never imagining that in saving her, he was also saving himself from a lifetime of solitude. "Best thing I ever did," he would reply, watching their children play on the hearth rug, their faces illuminated by the dancing firelight. "Riding out in that storm, finding you, it was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." And as another winter passed into spring, and spring into summer, the love that had kindled between them in the most desperate of circumstances continued to warm their hearts and their home, a testament to the unexpected gifts that sometimes emerge from life's most harrowing moments.